Welcome, mayors. We are glad you joined us for our fourth session of the 2023 Economic Mobility Leadership Institute mayoral cohort. My name is Stacy Fujii, and I'm with the African American Mayors. We have a couple of housekeeping items to consider. First, by now, you should have received an invitation to our private LinkedIn group. If you have not received that invitation, please let me or Darian Vason know. Second, Kenneth Kelly of Independence Bank has donated his book, Before I Let Go. You should have received that in the mail by now. If you have not, please let us know. That book, we are asking that you read it before the March 9th estate planning session so that you'll know everything that he's talking about. Finally, we look forward to seeing you at our April annual ALMA conference. Thank you. Now, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce our CEO, Phyllis Dickerson, for the welcome.
Thank you, Stacy. Welcome, mayors, to Emily's fourth session. It's great to see everyone. As you know, ALMA's Economic Mobility Leadership Institute is focused on critical learning opportunities for mayors and their teams, with the goal of creating strategic economic mobility plans to implement in your respective municipalities. Today, we begin our second session on home ownership. This hour-long session will provide insight and data, as well as share necessary and helpful tools available to develop great opportunities for home ownership within your communities. We hope you are enjoying this cohort, and we ask that you submit feedback in your monthly survey about days. Thank you for your participation and kind consideration. Back to you, Stacy.
Thank you, Phyllis. We have a little different setup today as we have two presentations. HUD is here today to share information about home ownership and programs to increase home ownership in our communities. Then we will proceed with a second presentation from Mr. Wilbur T. Pierce Sr. of the KKAC organization. Please remember to use the chat feature to ask questions throughout the session. Without further ado, let's begin. Today we have Julianne Joseph, a senior advisor of home ownership to the Housing and Urban Development Secretary, the Honorable Marcia Fudge. In this role, Ms. Joseph serves as the secretary level point of contact and subject matter expert on all home ownership issues, with a focus on expanding access to home ownership for diverse segments and first-time home buyers. Please welcome Julianne to the Economic Mobility Leadership Institute.
Thank you so much, Stacy, and thank you, Phyllis. Thank you all so much for having me here today. I'm so excited to be joining you. It is an exciting time at HUD right now. And of course, I bring greetings. I almost feel like I'm in church. I bring greetings from our HUD secretary, the Honorable Marcia L. Fudge. So she sends her regards as well. When I got the invitation to be able to join you all, I just couldn't wait to do it. There's so many wonderful things that we've been doing in the home ownership space that I can't wait to talk to you guys about. And also some of the efforts that we've made in order to help borrowers who have been struggling with COVID and you know, which has impacted their ability to pay their mortgages, and some of the resources that we have in place there. But just wanted to use a little bit of this time to just let you know what we've been up to, so that can be information that you all can mobilize to your constituents as you see fit. So first of all, again, I was the Deputy Assistant Secretary for about 20 months before the Secretary asked me to join her in her office right before Christmas to be her Senior Advisor for Home Ownership. Prior to that, being the Single Family Deputy Assistant Secretary, I basically handled all of the responsibilities for single family housing in FHA. So I was the FHA mortgage lady for about 19 months from the time that I was appointed by the Biden administration to serve, which has been the honor of my life. But I first want to share with you all a very exciting announcement that we have. Yesterday, we were able to join the Vice President at Bowie State for an announcement with FHA. Yesterday, we determined and published and announced that we're going to be reducing mortgage insurance premiums for new FHA borrowers. It's been over a decade since this took place before. But we felt that this was the appropriate time, considering how interest rates were continuing to rise, and affordability was such an issue for so many of our borrowers, particularly in communities of color. And we said, we need to do what we can to provide some relief. So we were so excited to announce yesterday that we were going to reduce mortgage insurance premiums. The average savings for an FHA borrower will be about $800 a month. I'm sorry, $800 a year. And we're really excited about that because we know that there are a lot of borrowers, especially who are young, who are just coming out of school, who are interested in throwing their hat into the homeownership ring. And we wanted to do what we could in order to ease a little bit of that pain in the affordability crisis that's going on right now. So that was a big announcement that Vice President Harris was able to deliver yesterday at Bowie State, and it was received very warmly. So we're excited about that. And previously, what we've been doing is putting a lot of focus on access to credit. It was mentioned in my bio by Stacy that, my focus in this current role is expanding access to credit to underserved communities, particularly Black and Brown communities. So I am an advocate at heart. While I'm a political appointee now, my roots started in mortgage origination. But at the downturn of the housing crisis, I then went to Baltimore, where I was a pre-purchase and foreclosure counselor in Baltimore in 2009, which was ground zero for the housing crisis. But what I can say is that is where I learned my why in working in housing policy. Seeing people literally in that condition was one of the saddest things that I had seen, but I committed that if I were to ever work in policy, I would ensure that anything that came from my pen would never leave people in the position that they were in that caused the housing crisis. So from every day from that point that I was a housing counselor in Baltimore, I've taken that experience with me in order to help others. So with that being said, that helped steer my career of how I wanted to assist communities that were underserved. One of the major policies that I authored was the student loan debt recalculation policy that was implemented in June of 2021. The policy amended the guidance that was currently on the books for FHA for borrowers who were in income-based repayment plans. So of course, when underwriting them, they were not fixed payments. And of course, as borrowers earned more, so would their payment increase because on income-based repayment plans. But the old guidance that was on the books would not take the actual monthly obligation that the borrowers were paying. What it would do is presume 1% of the outstanding balance of that borrower, as opposed to using what they were actually obligated to pay every month. So to give you an example, let's say that you have a borrower that has $100,000 in student loan debt. And let's say that their income repayment plan required them to pay $200 a month. Well, instead of underwriting them based on the $200 that they would pay per month and were obligated to pay to their servicer, they would actually be underwritten as if they had a $1,000 monthly obligation for their student loan debt, more than 4 times what the borrowers were actually paying in real life. And who is typically on an income-based repayment plan? Black and Brown communities. So what I had observed, not only as my time as originator, but also doing pre-purchase counseling, is finding that Black and Brown borrowers were being disqualified because of this student loan debt calculation policy. So when I actually came to DC to work at the Mortgage Bankers Association in their government housing programs division for residential policy, I told them that if I was going to take this job, they were going to have to let me work on the student loan debt calculation policy. And ironically, I lobbied HUD for 3 years in order to change that. But that was during the time of the Trump administration. But I continued to push and push and push. And literally the Friday before I was sworn in, Secretary Fudge actually implemented the policy to reduce the way that student loan debt was calculated, and literally takes the actual payment that is on a borrower's credit report, as opposed to using that multiplier for borrowers who are on income-based repayment plans. Sorry, my camera was sticking a little. So we're so excited now that for those borrowers who have student loan debt, that debt is no longer weighted heavier than any other debt on their credit report. They actually use the debt that's reported. So we were really excited about that. Another policy that I implemented at my time as the single family deputy assistant secretary was the incorporation of positive rental history to help borrowers qualify. So, again, another barrier in communities of color tends to be credit. And I was like, okay, well, how can we create a compensating factor? Because we know that, intergenerational wealth is not in our community. So it's not going to be a whole bunch of money in the bank that can offset weak credit. So what can we use? And I said, okay, well, what if we can use their current rental history as an indicator of how well they will perform when they have a mortgage? I said, because at the end of the day, our concern is, are you going to make that payment every month? And what better way to determine that by their history of the rent that they've paid, especially when you consider the fact that rent tends to be higher than mortgage payments for most borrowers. So I was committed to rolling that policy out. And in September of last year, we were able to implement that. So now for first-time home buyers, if they are able to show that they've paid their rent on time for 12 consecutive months, it serves as a compensating factor in the underwriting, in the automated underwriting system for those borrowers who have a 620 or higher, who may have been on the cusp and received a declination. We can take that into consideration to see if we can help them with their approval. So we were really excited about that. And then another thing that we did, taking into consideration the impacts of COVID. One thing that I observed as well as the DAS is that communities of color were hit even harder, more than any other cohort when COVID hit. So I said, okay, well, we know that a lot of wage earners lost, time and hours. Some people were furloughed. And I said, well, what can we do to ensure that when they come back to want to buy a house, that we don't hold this time against them, that they had a temporary interruption in income. So we rolled out policy again on that. So last April, we released a mortgagee letter that says that we will not hold it against a borrower if they seek financing, if they had a temporary interruption in income due to a COVID hardship. So we're excited about that to help those communities that may have been struggling. So those are some of the programs that we have on the access to credit front. Some of the things that we've done as far as loss mitigation is concerned, we are extremely proud of the efforts, because the day that I raised my hand to be sworn in, it was, again, June of 21. So we were in the thick of COVID. When I assumed the seat, I believe we had something like 839,000 borrowers who were in forbearance, and more than 1 million borrowers who were actually delinquent. And, they said, okay, Julian, welcome to the team. What are you going to do to make sure that we do not have a 2008? And I was like, okay. I was like, where's the water fountain? Where's the soda machine? No time for that. It was time to figure out how we could actually help these borrowers who were struggling. So, in addition to a lot of the efforts that we were doing to expand access to credit, we had to focus on making sure that borrowers who were struggling had resources. So today, I am so happy to report that of the nearly 2.3 million borrowers who have been delinquent since the course of the pandemic, almost 2 million of those borrowers have avoided foreclosure. So we have been able to help those borrowers save their homes. And there's still, a handful that are still in flight, that we're, assisting them with loss mitigation options to make sure that they save their homes. But we absolutely averted another 2008 housing crisis with the level of tools that we implemented. One of the things that we wanted to do to make sure that it was easy for borrowers to access assistance was to make sure that there wasn't a lot of paper. As a housing counselor in Baltimore after 2008, one of the major things that we saw was just how inundated the process was. The reason why people couldn't get help is because it was just too much paper. So the first thing we had to do is people need to be able to attest that they are having a hardship instead of having to prove that they had a hardship. There just wasn't enough time for that. So we wanted to ensure that the process was seamless and that we had options that were easy for people to take advantage of. And we're just really happy that we were able to avert a crisis like that. Also, some of the work that we're doing in the supply space, which is just as important as access to credit, because there's no need to help people get mortgages if there's nothing for them to buy. So again, at FHA, we wanted to figure out what levers we had, what kind of autonomy did we have in order to control supply. So of course, what we could utilize are the disposed properties, things that are in our REO division. So we incorporated a policy that embargoed, in essence, large commercial investors from bidding on properties until the 31st day of that foreclosure, and actually allowed owner occupants, state and local government, and nonprofits to bid first. Now, that first 30 days, it didn't require that the actual mortgage be closed, but the bidding process was literally reserved for owner-occupying borrowers, state and local government, and nonprofits. And we also have our claims without conveyance of title, which is called CWCOT. Those are properties that haven't actually been transitioned over into the portfolio of the secretary, but they are in the process of foreclosure. We actually allow those properties as well to be steered towards owner-occupying borrowers, nonprofits, and state and local government. So we're doing all that we can in order to help in that space. We've also recently published a request for information on the 203K. The 203K is one of those programs that's been around forever, but because it's been around forever, it actually needs renovation, with no pun intended. We have to figure out how to make that program more user-friendly. So what we did a couple of weeks ago was publish an RFI on the Federal Register, asking the industry to weigh in to let us know how to make that program a little more efficient. Especially for borrowers in the FHA space who might not be able to qualify for a renovation loan in the conventional space. We want to figure out how to make it easier for them to understand how to use it, and also for lenders to want to use it. So we have currently have a request for information out for the industry to let us know what improvements we can make to that program. So younger borrowers, or borrowers who are interested in using FHA financing, who need a little bit, the house needs a little bit of TLC, but not necessarily substantial reconstruction. Maybe it is just, changing the carpets. Maybe it is changing the windows for appliances. If those are the types of things that need to be done, we don't want them to feel that the market is even smaller with inventory because there's no tool in place for them to, utilize a mortgage to help do that rehab. So we want to make sure that that's a tool that FHA borrowers can access as well. So, and I believe that that's that period for providing feedback is through April, and that's on the Federal Register. And then one more thing that we have, I know we've been extremely busy, but one more thing that we have, we put out a request for information for small dollar mortgages, because we were observing as well that in some communities that don't necessarily have mortgages that exceed, $200,000 or more, it wasn't much incentive for lenders to do mortgages in those areas, which was causing a problem because, if lenders are saying, hey, it costs me too much money to do this loan and I'm literally losing money because, the income isn't enough that we're generating from it to do these, that is literally creating hardships in certain communities. And we wanted to figure out how do we address that. So we put a request for information out to the industry to receive feedback on what that price point would be. It used to be $100,000, but now with increasing costs in new construction and everything else, $100,000 might not be a small dollar mortgage anymore. It might be $175,000 depending on who you ask. So we've received that information, lots of feedback, and we're going to utilize that in order to potentially craft a type of pilot, maybe to create some incentive to supplement the income of lenders so they can feel more inclined to do these loans instead of saying we continue to lose money. We want to figure out, okay, well, if you do a loan in a certain area that has a lower dollar amount, perhaps we can incentivize the lenders by, investing in those communities. And then the last thing that I wanted to speak to you all about is PAVE. And I don't know if you all are familiar with this, but PAVE is one of the initiatives that the president charged the secretary with chairing along with Ambassador Rice to address appraisal bias. And that has been a major, major issue that we've been seeing, especially for existing homeowners who are in the refinance space, who have gone to try to extract equity for any particular reason, whether it's for renovation or education cost or, for what debt consolidation. We were finding that there's a huge disparity in communities of color in those values. So I've been working with the secretary on that and also trying to understand where those loopholes are in the appraisal process so we can plug them and to ensure that there are safeguards in place for that, if we see that racial bias actually is rearing its head. One thing that's currently out right now for review is a reconsideration of value policy, which allows borrowers who feel that racial bias may have been injected into their actual process to request a review of their appraisal. And this is in the FHA space. Up until this point, racial bias was not identified as a material defect on an appraisal. It is now going to be considered a material defect. And if that is the case, that then can trigger the request for a second appraisal. So now that we are identifying racial bias as a material defect, then that gives more recourse for a borrower instead of just escalating it to the point where, the only option right now was to go to the news or to go to the local state and licensing to try to pull the license of the appraiser. But in addition to those actions, this also gives them some type of recourse during the course of the actual loan process to ensure that they are getting a fair appraisal for their value. So those are just some of the things that we have been working on. We are extremely busy. I'm sure I skipped something that we've been working on, but I'm happy to take any questions that you all have. Phyllis, I don't know if we're taking questions right now or if we're waiting until the end.
Right. You actually have a few questions in the chat.
Okay, wonderful. I'm happy to take them.
So Stacey, you want to go through the questions?
Sure. So I think Mayor Jackson, did she cover your first question, sir, when you asked about Black and brown communities?
Yes, she covered it. She covered it somewhat. What I was more concerned with is as we look at the valuation process and how it's been, especially in the community that I'm in and the surrounding communities, which are low to middle income African Americans, these properties are a lot of times devalued. And what we're seeing even in the city of St. Louis is that when they degentrify neighborhoods and they come back in, then they renovate these homes.
Yep.
And then they buy them for $1,500, put some money into them, and then they put them back on the market for sale for $200,000, $300,000, $400,000, a house that was listed as being worth $45,000,
yep,
$49,000. And so if that be the case, it seems that someone at the HUD level or at some level should be looking into, okay, if this is what this house is going to be when it gets, remodeled or refurbished or rehabbed, then why not let that present homeowner use that to be able to borrow what that projected value is going to be so that he can get a construction loan for maybe $100,000, $125,000 to bring it up to that amount to where that house would then be worth that. It's something looking into because what's happening, people are being priced out of their own neighborhood.
Mm-hmm.
And so even though they're out of that house, they can't buy another house because they priced it so high. So that was the one question.
Yes.
And you can expound more on it if you want to.
And that's a great point. Thank you, Mayor Jackson. And as a matter of fact, a few years ago to talk about just some of the appraisal issues and value issues in Missouri, I remember Lacey Clay. I had a major conversation with him right after Michael Brown had been killed because, that first district in Ferguson had a very difficult time after he passed. One of the things which put on the radar are declining markets, because see, we're always looking at the number of how much houses are appraised, but there's also a thing called declining markets that takes place. And what former Representative Clay brought to my attention was, that appraisers were determining Ferguson to be a declining market, which can be even worse than giving a low value. Calling a neighborhood a declining market is contaminating the well. What you're basically saying is the values are dropping over here. Well, if you tell people that the values are dropping, what lender is going to want to go and step out and invest or do a mortgage in that particular community? So in that PAVE initiative that I mentioned, we've also added not just finding out how values are being stripped or how they're being overassessed in other communities that make it unaffordable for low to moderate income communities, but also deeming them declining markets, because then they create rental deserts, because then people can only rent there. That's it. Because if you don't have any homeowners there, it then opens up to what Mayor Jackson is mentioning, that cash will only be king. The only people who will be able to come in and buy are those who have cash that don't need financing, and then they can charge whatever price that they want. So, so we are very aware of that, and we made sure that we introduced that concern into the PAVE task force for there to be disparities when commercial investors can come in, jack the price up, and then make it impossible, either from the perspective of taxes for people to not be able to preserve them, or again, to your point, that they aren't even able to come back into the community and buy because they've been priced out. So we're aware of that, and we've added that to the action items that we're working on.
And then Stacey, I think you have a question from Bakari.
Yeah, we have one more, and then we've got another question from Robin Mack too. We can go ahead and hit Jabari's question, and then we'll go ahead and introduce Mr. Peer, and we may have a little bit of time on the back end that we could answer some more of these questions. But Jabari, you asked a very detailed question. Do you want to give Julianne maybe a quick synopsis?
Sure. So basically, I'm just kind of curious to understand the conversations and the collaboration between HUD and the National Flood Insurance Program. Because as we're seeing in the city of New Orleans and in Southeast Louisiana, not only are homeowner insurance premiums going up, but as well as flood insurance premiums. So I know you talked somewhat about some of the homeowner premium aspects, but just curious to know, have you guys had conversations with FEMA in regards to NFIP? Because for us, you know, it's a significant challenge to get into being a homeowner if, like, a lot of people don't understand that on the front end, you have to pay your entire year's premium and flood insurance out. So that's an additional, depending, $2,000 or $3,000 worth of cost. So just kind of curious, you know, what are you guys doing in that space?
Yes, thank you, Mayor Walker, for that question. Recently, we published a flood rule, and I don't know if you're aware of that, but because we knew that the NFIP was the only game in town, that was the only policy that was available. And of course, in Louisiana, I know that you are constantly watching that and what the rates are for homeowners. For rent, flood insurance. But what we wanted to do was create a level of competition, because at that point for FHA, NFIP was it. So whether they had that or not, if you couldn't get NFIP insurance, you couldn't get anything. So what we wanted to do with the final flood rule was to make sure that there was some competition in the market that gave homeowners the opportunity to shop. Because other than that, either one, NFIP may have been inadequate, and expensive, and not being able to provide the coverage that was needed. But we wanted to give borrowers choice to be able to find what would be the most affordable option for them, instead of, you know, predetermining that they had to go with NFIP. So we wanted to give them the opportunity to shop around to see if there was another flood insurance that would be more affordable for them, or provided the level of coverage that they needed in case they felt NFIP was inadequate. So, but we're continuing to observe that, because we know that, you know, the limits in which what we can do in private industry are limited, right? With us being the federal government, because we can't necessarily regulate that from FHA's perch. But what we can do is continue to have conversations with you all, that if there are things that we need to refine, let's say, for example, if we, you know, a couple of years from now, or if we find that what we put in the flood rule needs to have some expansion, or if there's something within our administrative authority that we can do within that rule to broaden our ability to help borrowers who are overly exposed to flood risk, then we would absolutely entertain that and see what we needed to do if we can make those modifications.
Okay.
But does that answer your question, Mayor Walker?
Yeah, it does. I think the one little plug I would say is, if you guys can figure out a way to get a seat at the table for FEMA with risk rating 2.0, because we're definitely having challenges understanding, you know, the ins and outs of risk rating 2.0 from a local level.
I would love to have a conversation with you offline too, just to get a little bit more information for that, to see what we can do to help support you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Julianne. We appreciate your presentation and all the hard work you all are doing over at HUD. Mayors, we will make Julianne's contact information available to you to gain more information about the programs we discussed today. And we might have a little bit more time at the end of our presentations today for more questions. Now we will move on with our second presentation. The KKAC organization is a 501c3 nonprofit providing education and technical assistance to historically underserved and socially disadvantaged farmers, ranchers, landowners, and youth. In its few years of operation, KKAC has developed a lasting footprint through its outreach efforts in Arkansas and Mississippi, establishing partnerships with the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, the United States Department of Agriculture, the Winthrop Rockefeller Foundation, the Walton Family Foundation, and the Nature Conservancy. Today, we are joined by Mr. Wilbur T. Pierce Sr., Chief Operating Officer of the KKAC organization and the Senior Partner of Management Solutions Incorporated, with ownership in a row crop farming operation and over 40 years of experience in managing projects with university and federal and state agencies. Please welcome Wilbur T. Pierce Sr. to the Economic Mobility Leadership Institute.
Good morning. Thank you, Miss Stacy. I wonder who is that person that you were talking about? Good morning, mayors. How are you all? Phyllis, thank you for affording me this opportunity. So the KKAC organization was started about 5 years ago. It was started by me and my brothers and my now deceased son who took his own life in April of 2018. We started the organization to educate minority youth about the business of agriculture production. We did that because I asked a student in Lee County, Arkansas, probably in 2009 or 10, where did she think string beans come from? She said, out of a can. I said, okay, we got a lot of work to do. Ms. Joseph talked earlier about intergenerational wealth, and that's what I want to talk a little bit about. We evolved from working with educating minority youth to working with the historically landowners. One of the things I want all of you all to know that if you are a farmer, you must be a business manager. You have to know something about chemistry. If you're on livestock, you got to know something about biology. You have to know a little bit about marketing. And if you own several hundred acres of land, you're pretty well off. Okay. What I said to a group of young men last night that our great grandparents and parents were much smarter than we are today. And the reason I say that, and I'll get into that a little bit more later on in my presentation, in 1915, we owned between 20 and 30 million acres of land. Now we own less than 2 million acres of land. And I want to highlight the fact that I'm talking to people from New York, Missouri, North Carolina, Texas, Georgia, Louisiana, Alabama, and Arkansas. And I'm sure some of you all who are in urban areas have relatives in rural areas. And I want to talk about how vitally important it is for you to check with them to see if you have some interest in heirs property. But let me talk a little bit about USDA programs so you all understand how you can take advantage of it no matter where you are. In educating our minority youth, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, which is an agency within the Department of Agriculture, we refer to NRCS as a wealth building agency. And the reason I say that to you all, they have a program called EQIP, which is the Environmental Quality Incentive Program. Now, as farmers, and when my son was living, we were farming about 4,500 acres of land. We purchased a 120-acre block of land for $1,576 an acre. By us being minorities, NRCS paid 90% of the cost of leveling the land. It cost us $140,000 to level that 120 acres of land. What did we pay? $14,000. What was the value of the land once we got through leveling it and putting irrigation on it? It went from $1,576 an acre to more than $4,150 an acre. People, that is wealth building. They pay for cover crops. nutrient management, they help with irrigation. Even if you're in urban areas, they will pay for you all to build a high tunnel. It is no need for us to have food deserts in our community, no matter where we are in the United States of America. If you have access to a vacant lot, you can go and apply to the Farm Services Agency for a farm number. And once you get that farm number, then you can go to the NRCS, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, your local district office, and apply to build a high tunnel, a hoop house. And they will provide resources to teach you how to work the soil and grow the crops. It is no reason for us to have food deserts in our community, none whatsoever. And I think, Stacey, what I'd like to do is leave my phone number. If you all have any questions about what I'm saying, please call our office in Arkansas. By the way, we are working in Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, North Carolina, and Florida, because it's vitally important for our people to understand the necessity of getting to know the agency employees in your communities so you can take advantage of the programs. The final program that I'm going to talk about in the EQIP category is the Agriculture Conservation Easement Program. That is a program that if you were in Arkansas, for instance, and you have 100 acres of cultivatable land that is eligible to be enrolled in the Conservation Easement Program, guess what, folks? The government will give you $3,800 per acre for the land to purchase the easement. You cannot grow crops on it anymore, but what they will do is spend another $600 or $700 an acre planting trees on it. Those trees are your trees. Once they mature, if you're old like me, you probably won't last long enough for the trees to mature, but your children will. That's your timber. Not only can you harvest the timber, but in the 2023 Farm Bill, they probably will start paying payments for carbon credits. If it's non-irrigated land, then they will give you $2,600 per acre. Pasture land, I think, is $1,900 per acre. They will give you that one-time payment. You keep the title to the land. You're still responsible for paying taxes on it. However, you can lease the land to duck hunters. And the way you lease land to hunters, you lease it to them by seasons. You lease it to them for duck hunting. You lease it to them for deer hunting. You lease it to them for rabbit hunting. So it's multiple ways to make money on farmland if it's enrolled in the Conservation Easement Program. There are barriers to enroll in the land. Some of the land you have to have a certain soil type. But when we started trying to help Black people get their lands enrolled in Arkansas, we went for 2 or 3 years where we could not get a single acre of land enrolled in the Conservation Easement Program. We applied for something called the RCPP program, where they granted us $2.5 million so we could pay for our own easement. However, there was a change at the national level where it set aside money for minority landowners to enroll their lands in the Conservation Easement Program. Why is that important? Because you can get paid near the fair market value of your land, and speak to the point that Ms. Joseph talked about, leaving it to your heirs for intergenerational wealth. One of the barriers is 95% of the landowners that we come in contact with, people, their lands are tied up in heirs property. And that is a very critical component in our communities. As I said earlier, in 1915, we owned between 20 and 30 million acres of land. Now we own less than 2 million acres. That was 14% of all the agriculture production land in this country. The land that we've lost probably equate to more than $300 or $400 billion. A lot of the land was lost because of bad public policy, discrimination. But you know what? 30% of the land was lost because we don't do proper estate planning. And we at our little agency, our company, we go around and talk to the ministers. We spoke to the Church of God in Christ Board of Bishops in Chicago in September, talked to the National Midwinter Board meeting of the National Baptist Convention in Birmingham, Alabama. And what we say, as the ministers say in Proverbs 13, 13:22, 13:22, a good person leave an inheritance for his children's children. But that's not good enough just to tell them they should leave an inheritance for their children's children. What we do at KKAC is go into the field and help them actually write the wills and trust. We have lost 98.5% of our land wealth in the last 108 years. Why are we doing what we're doing? Because if we go another 100 years, at the rate we're going, we will be landless people as it relates to agricultural production land. And as I'd say to the young people, a lot of young people and older African Americans consider farming being akin to slave labor. Trust me, people, it is not. Bill Gates, I think, is the largest production landowner in this country. And if he thinks it's important, why shouldn't we? Now, for those of you who have relatives in rural areas, check with them to see if you all have an interest in heirs property. Let us help you. The Nature Conservancy is an organization that's in 70 countries around the world. And we're the first minority organization they work with. The reason they're working with us because they were in Illinois, took some land for taxes from some Black people. Then they went out and built palatial estates on it. And the guy called me and asked me, what do you think about the article you read? I think it's atrocious. That's what I said to him. He said, that's what one of our board members said to us. And she rakes us over the coal. I said, I'm not interested in raking you over the coal. What I want to know is, what are you going to do to correct your bad behavior? And they said, what do you recommend? I said, what I want you to do is give me some money so we can go make sure that those type things don't happen again. And they did. So they fund us to help clear up heirs property issues and do proper estate planning. It is so important that all of you all that's listening to me today, if you don't have a will, go make a will. My preference is trust, because as I said to the National Baptist Convention, some Black person in America is being buried today without a will or trust. And guess what? We are losing wealth. And I'm going to close by saying this. The reason we have a lot of our young people incarcerated is because of the land that we've lost. Can you all imagine that if we had half of the land that we once owned, we would have more work for our young people to do. So if one of our kids go off to college and get strung out on drugs, guess what? Chances are that's his last opportunity to be successful in life, where the other community, they've passed their wealth from one generation to the next. So they can put him in drug rehab, put him in business, they go bankrupt, they bail him out again. But we cannot do that unless we start doing proper estate planning. Stacy, I think I've covered everything. I have Mr. Ryland on the phone, on the line with me in case you have some questions. I was brief, but I hope I was impactful. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Pierre. So, Mr. Pierre, you brought up a good point about in 1915, we owned millions of acres of land, between 20 and 30 million. And in 2023, we're down to a little over 2 million acres of land. And so I always ask myself, because we're more educated now, we make more money now, what is it that we're missing? Like, what is the reason that we keep losing land at this rate?
Well, it's quite intentional. I think most of you all are familiar with the 1890 land grant institutions that was created by Senator John Morrell back in 1890, and he created the 1862s. That's the University of Arkansas at Fayetteville, Florida A&M, the 1862 land grant institution. He created those institutions to educate the masses of the people, and the 1890 land grants were created to educate Black people in this country. Well, the Congress appropriate money for each one of the 1890 land grant institutions, and the state legislators supposed to match it dollar for dollar for the 1890 land grant institutions. They do not do that. They do it for the 1862s. And the purpose of the land grants was to teach agriculture, mechanical, and normal. Teach them about agriculture, teach them how to fix the equipment, and then teach them how to create teachers so we could teach the kids. Well, what has happened, agriculture education has systematically been taken out of our school. So if you don't have an appreciation for the value of land ownership, so you walk away from it. Most of the land that we lost is because people, I don't want nothing to do with the farm. Well, they didn't have appreciation for the value. We still farm. We don't farm as much as we did when my son was living, but you have to farm the land as well as the government programs. They got a lot of government programs. So I think, Phyllis, it's really out of ignorance having appreciation for production agriculture, the value of land, and proper estate planning. A lot of people leave particularly here in Arkansas, they left and went to Chicago, St. Louis, Detroit, just walked away from the land. And that has cost us. That's why one of the things that we say at KKC, if we can help make a cultural change in our community, get at least 20% of African Americans to systematically start doing proper estate planning, we may get an opportunity to recapture some of our land. And we still have a lot of land left in our communities, but the problem is most of it's tied up in heirs property. And it's quite cumbersome to clear up heirs property issues, but we're here to help you. We get money to help people clear up heirs property issues. All you have to do is call us, and I'm gonna just give you my number.
I
now.
actually put it in the chat. I put it in the chat so everybody can see. And I have one more question. Someone asked, I know there are regional directors in the conservation program. Will you make sure Stacy and Darian have those persons' contact information? Just email it to them so they can share it with the mayor so that they can follow up on how they can have access and get assistance in some of these government programs.
Stacy, I wish I could, because I did copy. We'll send it to you. We'll send it to you. Do you know how to email it to her now?
All righty. And then you guys, mayors and staff that are on the phone, we're going to give you a little inside tip, knowledge that nobody knows yet. So when we do our next session as it relates to wills and trusts, we have a little secret. We've actually paid for each one of you to do 10,000 wills in an electronic platform for free. So each of your cities will have the opportunity to grant 10,000 people in your city the ability to do their will online for free. It's an easy portal to use through First Independence Bank in Detroit. And it's going to be an amazing, amazing opportunity. And at the end of that piece, the tool will actually tell you how much you saved in Black generational wealth for the day. So once you have a launch for that event, you can do it at a Black church or a community center or wherever. And at the end of the day, it'll calculate how much you saved in Black generational wealth. So that's still, stay tuned for that opportunity. So get your family, your mama, your sister, your cousin, get them all ready and tell them we are all showing up and we're going to get this done and we're about to save that next generation of wealth. And so Ms. Joseph, you had another question for you. I know in the state of Arkansas, after a certain age, you actually get grandfathered into your personal property tax bracket. And so when you see gentrification coming into these neighborhoods, it doesn't really affect the people who are already living in the neighborhood. Because in DC, I've heard numerous times about how senior citizens are getting priced out of their house that they have already paid for because now they can't afford the taxes on it. And like I said, in some other states, you're grandfathered in after a certain age. Is HUD looking at a way to make sure that we protect, to Mr. Pierce's point, our senior citizens from losing their homes because they just can't afford the taxes anymore, being on fixed income? I tell people we're all on fixed incomes, but being on fixed incomes, to make sure that they maintain their houses. Are you guys looking at that?
Yes, and where we've predominantly seen this is in the HECM space, with HECM mortgages, particularly, you know, as you all know, that's the reverse mortgage in essence, especially during the course of the pandemic. We saw that there was a level of hardship that was hitting seniors. What we did, we have repayment plans that are available with the actual HECM program. For those seniors who are already in repayment plans, you know, it's literally a 5-year repayment for delinquent taxes and insurance. But because that there was new hardship that was actually experienced, if they already had an existing plan, it's not like a line of credit where, you know, you pay it down and you can come back and get it again. So what we did was modify the policy in order for seniors to be able to come back and get a fresh 5 years to incorporate any delinquent taxes and insurance that they had, instead of making them have to try to figure out how to handle those arrearages separately. The other thing that I want to underscore for everyone is that half money is still available, which is the Homeowners Assistance Fund. Now, I know that, you know, different programs are being handled differently, but from my understanding, there are still resources that are available, and it includes in a lot of states, whether it's just a traditional mortgage, despite the age of the borrower, or even if it is a HECM mortgage where where seniors are having issues with paying their taxes and insurance. Those funds are still available in order to help borrowers avoid foreclosure. So what I can do, I can really quick do a Google search and put the link in the chat, so you all can see what the current status of existing HAF programs are, how many are still running, and then it's literally a map, and you can click on it to see if funding is still available. So I'll drop that in the chat for you now.
And you talked about a lot of programs, and I noticed that a lot of the mayors on the call and staff are both on the call, that these were new to their ear. So how are you guys actually getting the information out? Because nobody, you know, our normal constituent isn't going to HUD.gov. So, how do we get the information out?
Yes, and that's something that we've really wanted to focus on too, because, you know, of course, there's a policy machine, right, that is responsible for making the policy, but there's also an amplification that needs to happen to make sure that the information makes it where it needs to go. So we've been partnering with our field policy and management team, which has regional administrators. Like, they literally are on the ground, who are working with, you know, faith-based organizations, who are working with, you know, nonprofits, PDCs, to make sure that the information is making it to the actual communities that need to know that. So we're working on almost like a toolkit that it gets more granular than just the federal level, that it's beyond just something you see on CNN when something major happens, but to make sure that we're actually deploying the information for our different regional arms that we have within HUD, to make sure that the information is making it actually down to the consumer. But yes, all of the information is on our site, but everybody doesn't necessarily know how to do that. So what we're doing is working with our regional administrators to make sure that we arm our local partners outside of the federal government, who are the spark plugs in the community, the people who do work in nonprofits, the ones who are able to get the information to that neighbor who might not be internet savvy, to make sure that the word is getting out. So we're actually working on that campaign right now.
Okay, perfect. And then I think Mary Jackson had a question about families that their land are being sold as a result of like highway expansion. Mm-hmm. And I know we saw this back in the day in Arkansas, actually in Little Rock, the 630 freeway was supposed to go through the 9th Street corridor, which was where all the Black businesses were predominantly in that corridor. And then in the end, they moved all those, dislocated all those businesses. And then the freeway ended up going 1 block over. So it didn't even, there was no reason to move them out. How are you guys addressing issues like that, where it disenfranchises or dislocates, people in those kind of areas?
Yes, so eminent domain is an issue, and this is where we have that I don't want to say disconnect, but there's that separation of powers and jurisdiction, right? That the state and local jurisdictions have that authority in order to do it, especially if they're saying it's for the public good, is usually how they try to justify eminent domain, which makes it difficult. We have similar conversations when it comes to zoning, right? Like when we're trying to find ways to do things in the multifamily housing space, oftentimes that there's some tension there when we try to come in as the government to tell local government how they need to conduct their business. So we hear about eminent domain often, but there is also, our hands are a bit tied in certain situations. If, for example, they're doing something that they're saying to build a hospital or to build an interstate, that they're saying that it's justifiable to do eminent domain because it's, something that's ultimately for the public good. That is difficult, but that is something that we can absolutely, that is just because it's difficult doesn't mean it's impossible, but that is just a tension that has always kind of been there with the federal government as opposed to local government, and what our jurisdiction is as opposed to theirs, and what our autonomy is in order to inject ourselves into those conversations.
Perfect. If you need some help with DOT on that, let us know so we can highlight that conversation. So Stacey, you want to close us out?
Absolutely. We want to thank everyone for joining us today. We've recorded today's session and we'll make this available online. You'll also be able to gather the information links that was shared today in our EMLI LinkedIn group. We want to give a special thanks to Julianne, to Wilbur, to all the people at HUD and the KKAC organization for helping us complete our second and final session on home ownership. Our next session will be held on March 9th, 2023, focusing on estate planning. Be sure to follow us on social media at Our Mayors and visit us online at ourmayors.org. Thank you for joining us today. This concludes the session.
Thank you.